The evening table, intended as a sanctuary of warmth and civility, transformed instead into an arena of quiet hostility. Each clink of cutlery upon porcelain reverberated with unspoken judgment, and beneath the chandelier's muted glow, I felt myself scrutinized as though under a merciless spotlight. Their gazes lingered too long, calculating, dissecting, condemning. I attempted composure, a fragile smile carved across my face, yet an uneasy nod at me. Perhaps, I reasoned, it was my own insecurity casting shadows upon their stares. But then, like a verdict delivered by an unfeeling court, his father's voice cleaved the air. "You are nothing but useless trash. My son deserves better." The words did not merely strike, they seared. They lodged themselves in the marrow of my bones, echoing with a cruelty that stripped the room of oxygen. My chest constricted, my palms dampened beneath the table's polished wood, and a suffocating silence engulfed me. I turned instinctively to the man beside me, the one I had believed would be my shield, my confidant. Yet he sat motionless, lips pressed into silence, his eyes refusing to rise against the tyranny of his father's disdain. That betrayal, subtle yet immense, wounded me far deeper than the insult itself. His mother, feigning blindness, continued to saw delicately at her roast. His sister, lips curled into a mocking half-smile, drank in the spectacle with quiet delight. And I, bleeding within, realized in that moment that I was not merely unwelcome, I was an intruder in their carefully curated world. But they had underestimated me. I was no fragile ornament to be dismissed and discarded. The venom of his father's words did not shatter me, it steeled me. For I understood then humiliation was not my ending. It was the ignition of a fire they would soon come to fear. Because vengeance, when tempered by patience, is not a storm. It is an eclipse. And I was prepared to blot out their sun. The days that followed were not defined by outward fury, but by a simmering silence, a silence that cloaked my heart like velvet yet concealed a blade beneath its folds. To the untrained eye, I remained composed, smiling when spoken to, courteous in gesture, pliant in presence. But within me, the insult fermented, darkening into a draught far more potent than anger. I began to observe them with meticulous precision. Their lives, so proudly displayed in gilded frames and polished anecdotes, were riddled with fissures invisible to themselves. His father, vainglorious in speech, paraded as a paragon of virtue. Yet I knew whispers of his dealings, accounts unbalanced, promises betrayed, alliances sustained only by fear. His mother, dainty in pearls, carried secrets like shadows behind her eyes, carefully veiled beneath perfumed grace. And the sister, draped in entitlement, wielded envy like a concealed dagger. At dinners henceforth, I allowed his father's gaze to pierce me without flinch. He mistook my silence for submission, blind to the fact that every syllable he hurled at me was being carefully catalogued, arranged, and sharpened into a weapon of my own design. I did not retaliate with words scatter like dust in the wind. I would answer with something more enduring, an unraveling of the very fabric he wrapped himself in. My boyfriend, meanwhile, seemed torn, caught between filial obedience and quiet shame. He spoke little, but his eyes betrayed him guilt gnawed at the edges of his composure. Yet he lacked the courage to confront his father's tyranny, and so his silence became complicity. I recognized then that he, too, was not my ally but merely a pawn, one who would crumble beneath the weight of loyalty, when forced to choose. Night after night, I lay awake, my mind a theater of strategies. Revenge, I knew, was not a hasty blade but a patient architecture. One does not strike immediately, one waits until the structure is brittle enough that a single touch brings it crashing down. And so I waited, not with resignation, but with the stillness of a predator before the leap. For what they failed to understand was this humiliation can either extinguish or transform. In me, it had awakened something formidable, something they would regret underestimating. Their dining table, once my gallows, would soon become the altar of their disgrace. The machinery of retribution is assembled in quiet rooms, behind closed doors, where patience is the architect and proof the mason. I set mine into motion with the methodical calm of someone who understands that haste is the ally of failure. Each move was measured, deliberate, an economy of motion designed to extract the greatest fracture from the smallest strike. First, I mined their comforts. I traced transfers, parsed statements, and reconstructed the ledger of their borrowed opulence. Where they had thought my generosity anonymous and inexhaustible, I found pattern and purposey recurring vendors, unfamiliar hotel names, payments flagged to accounts that did not belong to any of us. The ledger, once decrypted, read like a confession. I made copies, paper and pixel, stored them beneath trivialities: an old address book, a child's school scrapbook, a tin of loose buttons. The ordinary conceals best. Then I watched them. Not with fury, but with the dispassionate curiosity of an observer cataloging symptoms. He, the man who refused to defend me, tried to soothe his conscience with small kindnesses that tasted of cowardice. She, the woman who had smiled and looted, grew bolder as the months thinned, extravagances multiplied, and a careless confidence crept into her step. It is in that confidence that most deceivers fall. They lavish appetite on themselves, forgetting the ledger in the locked drawer. I cultivated allies whose skills were unglamorous but indispensable. A discreet investigator delivered photographs taken at times she had claimed to be elsewhere. A bank officer, paid with the discretion of a favor well returned, provided annotated statements indicating transfers, preliminary flags, and the obscure account into which funds had been siphoned. A lawyer, whom I consulted with the cold clarity of someone protecting a legacy, drafted amendments, trusts, and directives that would make the assets immovable by impulse or charm. My tactics were surgical. I did not wish to rend with spectacle. Spectacle is noisy and often reversible. Instead, I sought to rearrange the scaffolding of their entitlement. I retitled holdings into irrevocable trusts and presented the veneer of magnanimity, even as I closed gates behind them. Credit lines were rerouted. Joint privileges dissolved under paper that read benevolent in public but ironclad in clause. The banking phone number they had relied upon no longer reached accounts in their name. The simple act of changing a password had dominoes attached to it. There were nights I rehearsed my face, a neutral mask that would not betray the tempest beneath. When they complained about inconvenience, I smiled and poured tea. When he muttered about unfairness, I nodded with the patient air of someone who views indignation as a temporary fever. Each irritation I allowed was a pebble placed upon the slope that would, in time, become an avalanche. The most exquisite instrument, however, was not law nor ledger but narrative. People believe in stories more than in facts when the facts lack context. So I composed one, a neat folder bound with a ribbon, innocuous enough to appear as a dated family album. Inside, however, were the annotations, cold messages, receipts, photographs, and bank printouts, arranged so that each page completed the other. It was not merely evidence. It was a narrative of betrayal told in the language they could not deny. When the folder left my hands, it would speak the dialect of irrefutable truth. Until then, it lay in my drawer like a sleeping thing, patient and poised. I also engineered small exposures, almost accidents that confirmed my thesis to those around them. A neighbor mentioned seeing the woman with a man at a hotel. A mechanic remarked on her sudden cash payments. An erstwhile friend confessed, over tea, that she had loaned money and never been repaid. These tidbits were the pins I scattered across their world, each one ready to snag and unravel a thread when the time arrived. All of this required restraint. At times I felt the animal itch to confront, to leap and rend. But I had learned the hard lesson: the righteous strike that comes from heat is often wasted. The true strike, the one that finishes, is tempered and cold. It arrives when the contriver of wrongs has already exhausted their currency of denial. So I waited. I watched them erode themselves with purchases and complacency. I let them speak into their phones with the careless abandon of those who believe themselves unseen. I let my son cradle his illusions, for as long as necessary, so that when the folder found his hands, the collapse would be more devastating for having been so gently delayed. By the time the first breadcrumb was revealed, an innocuous card decline at a boutique she frequented, she was already teetering upon a precipice. The little panic that fluttered at the edges of her composure was the first fissure. In that cracking sound lay the music of the endgame. I had assembled evidence, locked the legal doors, and set the narrative in place. Now, only the final hand remained to place the folder where it would be opened and read without preamble. The plan, simple in outline, was cruel in its completeness. I would not shout, I would not pummel. I would present the ledger. The images, the receipts at the table where they had mocked me. I would let the weight of what they had done fall into their own laps. And when the silence afterward became too loud, I would watch as the fabric of their domestic certainty unraveled thread by thread. Revenge, I understood, is less about satisfaction than about rectitude. It is the restoration of balance on a scale that only the betrayer believed in their favor. I had set that scale, calibrated every weight, and now, secretly, delighted in the precision of the pendulum's swing. The evening I chose was ordinary by design. A roast, a pastel tablecloth, the same plates they had used for birthdays and anniversaries. Ordinary masks suspicion, it softens the blow. He arrived flushed from work, his manner businesslike, still reclining in the easy conviction of a son who had never been forced to reckon. She glided in with practiced ease, pearls clicking, a smile that had learned to look innocent. They sat opposite me as if the room were neutral ground. It was precisely because it looked so benign that their downfall would feel inevitable. I placed the folder upon the table as one might set a kettle on a stove. Simple, inevitable. The ribbon lay slack, the cover bore no flourish. She did not notice at first, her eyes were already finding the nearest mirror to smooth a stray hair. He did notice. He watched the movement of my hands with a curiosity sharpened by unease, but he still misread the moment as a maternal anecdote, rather than a verdict. Just some old papers, I said lightly, as though the phrase could anesthetize what followed. I poured tea with the same steady hand I had used through years of quieter patience, and then, without flourish, I opened the folder. The room contracted. Every sound, cutlery, the clock's tick, a distant radio, receded as if the house itself leaned in to listen. Photographs, first candid images of her in places she had denied, hotel lobbies, room keys with dates, her hand upon a stranger's arm. Receipts next, swanky boutiques, couriers, transactions routed to accounts that bore names not ours. There were messages, plain, brutal, where affection traded for currency, promises exchanged for hush. Each item was annotated, each anomaly flagged and explained in a tone as clinical as an accountant's ledger. The narrative within those pages did not ask for belief, it demanded it. She laughed at first, a brittle sound that tried to pass for incredulity. "This is ridiculous," she said, voice high with the performance of hurt. He frowned and rifled through the pages, his expression a palimpsest of denial and dawning comprehension. The more he read, the more his face drained, color ebbed from his cheeks, as if the facts were a solvent dissolving the varnish of his convictions. His first instinct was protest. "You've misread this," he began, words tripping over themselves in alarm. But the documents were small, precise, and the mosaic they formed left no room for reinterpretation. Misreading requires ambiguity, there was none. The ledger was a mirror that reflected not a single flash of error, but months of deliberate elimination. Transfers, redirects, the surgical redirection of funds and favors under the guise of generosity. I watched him as a surgeon watches the patient awakens with clinical attention and unfeigned pity. The man before me, who once kissed my hand after long days, who once asked my counsel about mortgages and medicine, was now being compelled to measure the distance between who he had believed in and who stood before him. His hands trembled, his lips parted and closed like a caged bird testing the air. For the first time since I had known him, he looked genuinely small. She, however, altered her tactics. From the performance of disbelief she slid into accusation, an occupational pivot born of desperation. "You're trying to ruin us," she spat, pointing a painted finger with theatrical outrage. "You're jealous. You want to take what's ours." Her voice pitched to attract sympathy, to redouble his defenses. The sister, quick to a sneer, began rehearsing the lines of indignation. Their chorus was practiced, it had been played before. But I had not come to refute noise. I had come with an arsenal of corroboration. A printed log of bank confirmations, an independent investigator's note, corroborating sightings and dates, and a lawyer's letter outlining the legal ramifications that were now in motion. The trust redirections, the amendments, the irrevocable clauses. Words that read mundane on paper, but in practice were a lock. I slid a copy across to him, the revised will, the trust instrument, the schedules that rendered certain assets inaccessible to anyone but him, conditional upon the dissolution of his marriage should fidelity be disproved. It was austere, precise, and finally comprehensible. The room tilted. He repeated a name once, her name, then faltered as the syllable lost its sheltering incantation. The sound of his breath was shallow, and the last scaffolds of his defenses collapsed. He looked at me as if seeking permission to hate or forgive, and in that look I saw every child he had been. The decision that lay before him was not merely legal, it was moral, filial, and existential. He could deny the papers and cling to the woman who had remade him in her image, or he could accept the documents and, perhaps, reclaim what had been pilfered. He left the table, not with fury but with that peculiar silence of someone stepping off a cliff into the unknown. I did not follow. I let the room hold its own unspooling. In the hours that followed, voices rose and fell in the hallways like flurries of restless birds. There were pleas and accusations, phone calls clipped and desperate, the small domestic sounds of a household unthreading. By the next dawn, whispers had seeped beyond the house. The neighbor who always admired the couple's seeming prosperity asked questions that had previously felt impertinent. A cousin returned a loan demand with a tone that suggested insurance rather than familiarity. The sister discovered, with raw anger, that a promised loan had been rescinded. These ripples multiplied. Privilege is brittle when its source is exposed. I sat alone with my tea and watched the light shift across the floorboards. The satisfaction I felt was not a roaring triumph. It was a measured recognition that order had been restored. By law, by memory, and by the slow arithmetic of consequence. Yet even as the household began to fracture, a part of me catalogued the cost. Victory, I knew, came with collateral. The son's astonishment, the family's scandal, the way neighbors would now weigh us with renewed curiosity. Such things were the price of redress. In the afternoons that followed, the couple made frantic attempts to salvage their reputation. There were calls to accountants, vows of innocence made before disbelieving ears, and angry letters demanding the return of funds they could no longer access. Each effort only further demonstrated the network of deception. The more they scrambled, the clearer the pattern became to onlookers. The sisters' social circle thinned. Suppliers who had once smiled now wrote terse emails. The facade they had inhabited for so long flaked away under sunlight and scrutiny. Yet the most poignant moment came later, in a silence after the storm, when the son returned alone. He entered the room with eyes that had weathered a long night and sat without a word. No accusation, no apology at first, only a tired curiosity. He opened the folder as if reopening an old wound. He touched a photograph and did not look away. The confrontation we had engineered had not been noisy, it had been surgical. He did not require my spectacle. The truth served as its own indictment. He looked up at last, the child he had been and the man he must become layered in that gaze. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked simply, bereft of accusation, instead carving out space for regret. His voice betrayed exhaustion, as though the weight of inheritance, expectation, and betrayal had settled upon him. I answered with a brevity that carried epoch's truth, must be unassailable to heal. It must be given in a form that cannot be argued into meaninglessness. I had not wanted his fury. I had wanted his clarity. He stayed until dusk, neither reconciled nor resentful but rearranged. The family's rhythm had shifted, a new ledger had been written. Their dinners would henceforth include an emptiness that could not be filled by perfumed smiles or polished silver. The woman left weeks later, with the dignity of someone sharply aware of what she had lost and what she could not reclaim. The sisters' invitations dwindled. The father continued to attend local gatherings, but with an air diminished, as if his boastful voice had been softened by the reality of exposure. I did not cheer at their diminishment. My victory was not vindictive jubilation, it was the quiet settling of accounts. The house, once humming with clarion calls of entitlement, was now quieter, less assured, perhaps, but more honest in its cadences. I had not sought to destroy so much as to correct an imbalance. In the ledger of life, entries had been adjusted, and the scales that once leaned unfairly were now, at least for a moment, level. As evening came, I closed the folder and placed it back where it belonged. A modest, final act. The papers would be summoned again when paperwork was required, when banks and lawyers spoke in the official tongue of authority. But for now they slept between covers, a quiet testament to the work that had been done. Outside, life continued. Neighbors tended gardens, a bus hummed past, children chased pigeons. The world rolled on, indifferent. Inside, however, a change had been wrought, one that would ripple quietly for years. I sipped my tea, felt its heat, and understood at last that justice, when patient and precise, arrives not as spectacle but as calibration. The scales had tilted, balance had returned. Time has a peculiar way of settling dust. What once erupted as scandal gradually becomes silence, but silence is not amnesia. It is sediment, layer upon layer, memory compressed into permanence. Weeks after the storm, the household was not merely quieter, it was hollow. The walls seemed to echo differently, as if they too mourned the vanishing illusions that once filled their rooms. The woman, once brazen, sharp, tongued, adorned in borrowed luxury, was gone. She departed not with grandeur, but with hurried suitcases, leaving behind garments too stained by shame to salvage. Her departure was not announced, nor was it resisted. It was simply permitted, like an infection drained from a wound. The neighbors, who once envied her displays, now spoke of her in hushed tones, as though her name itself carried contagion. The son remained, though he was not the same man who had once defended her so ferociously. He moved through the house as one might wander a ruin, careful, reverent, and ashamed. His voice, when it broke the silence, carried neither accusation nor defense, only the subdued cadence of someone who had seen his own naivete laid bare. He did not ask me for forgiveness, instead, he lived in the quiet acknowledgement of what my silence had taught him. That was enough. As for his father, the man whose venomous words had branded me useless trash, his downfall was subtler yet far more profound. The grandeur with which he once commanded rooms, the hauteur with which he diminished others, had ebbed. At gatherings, his voice no longer cut the air, but drifted uncertainly, like smoke dispersing. Men who once clapped his back with admiration now nodded with a courtesy emptied of respect. The revelation of his household's fractures had tarnished his authority more efficiently than any slander ever could. Pride, once his fortress, had become his prison. And me. I did not dance upon their ruin. Triumph, for me, was not a matter of fireworks but of balance restored. I had not needed to raise my voice, nor to stain my hands with vulgarity. My vengeance had been constructed with patience, each brick laid in silence, until the edifice of deceit collapsed under its own weight. The sweetest justice is not loud, it is meticulous, irrevocable, and undeniable. Now, when I sit at my own table, I no longer taste bitterness in the tea. Instead, there is calm. My gaze rests not upon what was taken from me, but upon what was preserved: dignity, agency, and the unshakable knowledge that cruelty can be answered without lowering oneself into its mire. Their downfall is not my identity, it is merely the closing of a ledger long unbalanced. In the end, I did not destroy them. They destroyed themselves. I merely held the mirror steady. And when they peered into its merciless reflection, they saw not me, but the sum of their own choices, their own betrayals, their own folly. That was the truest revenge.